Hello and welcome to YAF Podcast, the yet another Final Fantasy podcast. This is Season 6, Episode 14, Albrook. Or Albrook, Tzen, and Maranda, I guess. Well, we've visited quite a few places. I want to talk about this real quick. This is an interesting episode. So, at the end of 2021, I decided to take basically like a non-specified break from playing Final Fantasy, from recording and editing the podcast. And then a few months later, I guess like 6 months later, I guess back in May 2022, I released the first episode in a long time. Since then, I've been kind of trying to release episodes on and off whenever I could. I kind of realized that there's no way I can make a weekly cadence. There's just way too much stuff going on in my life, and it's gotten like really busy over the past year. So it's just like not an option to do this like, you know, on a regular basis without any like outside help. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that. It's kind of interesting. I'm looking at my notes right now, and so I am recording this in early July. I finished playing the content for this specific episode, I think middle of June, but I started the notes back in late October of 2021. So like that, those are the time periods, those are the lengths of time that like kind of took place since last episode. So just like last episode was, you know, recorded back in October 2021. This episode is being recorded in July 2022. So and who knows when it'll come out. It's going to sound really interesting to hear like, oh yeah, like, you know, it took like 6 months for the episode to come out. So what happened since last episode, and it's kind of a refresher for me as well, we got a ship. We got a ship that allows us to fly around a bit, but it takes us only to one place. We're trying to get to the heart of the Empire. And the heart of the Empire is Vector, like that's the main, or that's the capital city. And we're not going there yet. So the ship takes us to the continent where we need to be, lands us right next to a tiny little town. Seems to be like a regular town, but it's occupied. It doesn't really have like the best weapons, but there are a few things that we learned from that town. We learned that there's Tzen to the north and Maranda to the west. So it looks, actually, like the town looks so similar to every other town that I had to double check that I was in the right place. So it was kind of interesting because this is where I left off with the gameplay back in late 2021, and I was like, I've been in this town before, and then realizing like, no, you haven't been in this town. They just all look the same. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that like there's obviously a reuse of textures, but at the same time, you know, I think there wouldn't be too many differences between towns like back in Fantasyland, but at the same time, this is a completely different continent. So it's a little bit of a weirdness, but also not weirdness. I'm not sure how to feel about the towns basically kind of blending together at this point, but whatever. And there's something important to the east. That's the other thing that we learned. Went to sleep at the inn, and then I also found out that Vector, our final destination, I guess, for the Empire, is at the center of the continent. So those are the different cities where we're at. And the first town that we went to was Albrook, I think. That's the nondescript town. I ended up going to Tzen first, went north, and it was an occupied and damaged city. So, and that's kind of something that I always like in these games, is whenever they're like, oh, this is a war-torn town, and you can actually see it, right? Like you can see that there's damage to the town, and it's not great and everything. And it's always disappointing when they're like, oh, we're having a really hard time, and you're like, this is a really happy, bright, and colorful town. Like, what do you mean you're having a hard time? That doesn't set the mood right. So this one definitely did. We find out that the Empire like killed just about everyone, and that there is a secret weapon called the Guardian, and it cannot be moved, but it's very powerful. That's kind of what we learn about it. I next went to an occupied outpost, so I got east and west confused. East is right, west is left on a map. I can tell like the cardinal directions in real life really easily, but for some reason, whenever I look at a map, I have to remind myself which way is west and east. So that's kind of what happened there. And I kept getting thrown out, and I thought it was Maranda, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do in this town? Basically, what happens is that whenever you run into a soldier, you can try to defeat them, and if you defeat them in this town, you get thrown out. So I tried to sneak past all the different people, and I did. Like, I basically explored the entire map. You have to like sneak around people so they don't run into you. You don't want them to accidentally step into you when they're turning around on like really thin ledges. It was a small little puzzle that got me nowhere. Eventually I went to Maranda, and I recorded, or I was editing an episode a few weeks or around this time that mentioned Maranda as well. So it was really, it's actually really cool to edit an episode and be like, oh yeah, so this is like where we find out what happened. So Maranda is the town that Celeste destroyed. So this is the town that I think it was Cyan was giving Celeste, a tough time about, because as far as I know, it was basically like a really, it was not a good time. I think this was the town where Celeste finally said, like, no, I'm not going through with this anymore. I'm going to stand up to the Empire. I don't want to follow the orders. And when she got, arrested and eventually Locke freed her quite a few episodes ago. The town is pretty worn down. There was basically a decent attack. You can see that it was definitely attacked. And then kind of like what occurred to me is something interesting around all of this. So if all of the towns are occupied, which means that they were resisting, right? Like they were fighting back, and the Empire's capital is Vector, does that mean that the Empire was just Vector for a very long time until they invaded their neighbors? Like, I'm thinking about this, and if Vector is the capital and where everything started, going to Maranda, so, like, we must be, like, basically very early on in this, not early on, but, like, relatively early on in this battle, right? Because Vector basically was able to attack Maranda. That's when Celeste was arrested. I can't imagine that she was arrested for a very long time. Obviously, it hasn't been rebuilt. It's damaged. Like, there's just something about that. Same with Tzen, and same with Tzen, which was kind of like damaged, and Albrook that was like occupied. Like, it seems like the Empire's conquest is fairly recent, and I think that's actually an important point. And sometimes it happens in the games where you're thrown into the middle of this story, and so you assume that it's been around for a long time. Like, you assume that maybe Vector or like the Empire has been trying to conquer all these different cities and countries for, I don't know, for the past 20, 30 years or something. But this seems like, oh no, they like decided to do this in the past year or two. Like, it's a very recent change. And say that's the same with like the Rebels as well, right? What's interesting is, again, like drawing the parallels between Final Fantasy and Star Wars. And I think it's a really good parallel, because I think Final Fantasy 2 was very much like Star Wars. It reminded me of it a lot. And same here. And I mean, it's cliche, right? Like Empire, and there are the Returners, which is like the Rebels, right? And everything. But in the story of Star Wars, there were some, like, a significant amount of time that passed through everything, right? You start in episode 1, Anakin is a kid, I don't know, like 8 years old or something. Like, you could look up the lore. By the time that he's like almost 20, or like, I guess mid-teens, like 14, 15 years old or something, he's a Padawan in the second movie. So in the first movie, you already had the occupation, that was the first planet, and it took like half a decade, or more than half a decade, to get to the second movie where the Clone Wars started, and then it took years and years later for the third movie came out. So I think Anakin was like maybe in his earlier mid-20s. I don't know what the canon is, but that's kind of what it seemed like. And so it took like decades for them to get to the Empire being in strength, and then it took like decades more for the Empire to topple. Unless I got this is not a Star Wars podcast, so but I might have gotten some of the details wrong. But Luke was born at the end of movie 3, and then he was in his late teens in the fourth movie, or the original Star Wars, maybe in his 20s. I don't remember, but it was definitely like a decade and a half that passed. So like all these big times passed, but in this game, it really seems like it's just been maybe a few years. Like it doesn't seem like it's been a very long time that they've been doing this. And it's also bizarre to think that Vector is basically the end all be all of the Empire. There are no secondary Empire cities that aren't occupied forcefully, right? There don't seem to be any villages that are also part of the Empire that weren't forcefully occupied as well. So it's an interesting kind of thing to look at, that this Empire was just a town. And I'm making a conjecture here and kind of going off topic, but just thinking about the fact that the Empire might have been just like a small town that got very industrious, was able to conquer magic in some way, and then just basically went on a rampage of taking over everything in the known world, right? That there was like such an uptick in what they were doing, like from 0 to 100 essentially. One thing that I found in Maranda was, and that's a callback to an earlier episode as well, was the woman that one guy was sending letters to. I read in the guide online that I think if you can go between these two towns somehow, you can keep their conversation going. Like I think you have to remind the woman that, oh hey, you should probably send that letter, and then he gets a letter, and I don't know. I don't really go much further into that, but, so Maranda was kind of an interesting town to see because of all these different little stories and the allusions to it throughout the game. So the letters and Celeste's past. I don't think we found out much about Celeste's past here. Like, we only know that the town was conquered and damaged. There was a dog fight that we went, like, literally, like literal dogs, not like airplanes or something, but just dogs fighting. I think it was like bored Empire soldiers, like, getting dogs to fight each other, which is really messed up. And one thing I did notice that in the game was some of the small details. So, for example, some of the roofs will have, like, birds walking across. And that's just something that, like, sometimes I don't notice. And I noticed it when I was playing this. And I was like, holy, wow, like, there is a bird slowly walking across the rooftop. And sometimes, these sprites and these, like, 2D textures can feel very flat, right? Like, you might have all the lighting and everything right, and you're like, okay, I get what's going on here, but I'm looking at the picture of the inn, and you're like, yeah, it kind of feels flat. Having just that bird interact with that roof that you can never interact with, but having it interact with it in this 3-dimensional space was, like, a really nice little detail. It makes me wonder if it was in the original SNES version as well, or if it's just, like, a advanced edition. I guess there's no reason to not think that it was in the SNES version. Whatever. One other detail is that there was a soldier harassing a woman, so, like, he was running after her and she was running away from him, and he was basically trying to get her. So there's a lot of, like, you could tell that the citizens of this town were essentially, like, second-class citizens. They were kind of, the soldiers were doing whatever they wanted. I think you can tell that they were bored, so maybe that was supposed to signify, like, a passage of time. I say bored because they had enough time and safety to feel like, hey, I can have dogs fighting each other, and I'm gonna go run after one of the citizens of this town and try to, like, get her to marry him or something like that. Like, it's kind of it's messed up. Kind of an interesting thing. I did walk around essentially, like, the entire continent, except the soldier outpost that I mistook for Maranda is blocking the way from going further east. So I didn't get to that part, but it is kind of interesting just, like, seeing this vast continent and this one city that was able to conquer all of the others. I didn't realize that this would be so short. So, this is pretty much it for the stories. For the story, I had to visit, like, 3 different towns. I have a few interesting things about this. So this is episode 14 for this podcast. It's episode 12 for the guide, but it's episode 13 for the page title on the guide, and it's part 8 in the URL. So, like, the guide itself went through a lot of different changes, so it's kind of funny. That's 14, but it's also 12 and 13 and 8, and that's just kind of funny. Yeah, so, that's it for this episode. It was a quick one. It didn't take me too long to play, but it just took me a long time to recover from burnout. And actually, maybe if we have some extra time, that's something worth talking about. Burnout is real. If you have your own podcast, or if you have your own project and you're, like, meticulously working on it, it's totally normal to get overwhelmed by it. It's totally normal to just be like, wow, I've been doing this for like 3 months and I'm tired and I don't know if I want to look at Final Fantasy games anymore. I think that's kind of the hard part of these games, is that even if I'm not interested in Final Fantasy, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to play JRPG. I just went on a whole thing where I'm going through all the Halo games in my spare time, and that's fun. And I was like, oh, I should make a podcast about it. I'm like, nah, I would probably ruin it for myself. And not just that, but I would get eventually, like, burnt out and not wanting to play these games. And when you're playing them just for fun for yourself, it's totally fine to just take a few months of a break. But if you're trying to keep up a weekly podcast, it's rough, because you have to either edit episodes or record episodes or play the game. You have to interact with the medium somehow, even if you don't feel like it. So I definitely gave myself like a nondescript, non-defined, long period of time to just like recover and get back into Final Fantasy if I wanted to. And it's a fun thing to dip back into, to just be like, okay, I am having a, very relaxed week. I'm not seeing any people. I don't have any plans. Why don't I just get a little bit further in Final Fantasy while watching my favorite show or something like that? And I think that's fun, and that's fine. Editing episodes is a little bit tougher because I cannot like just sit down and focus on editing. That is extremely difficult for me. I used to enjoy it because I found it a little bit relaxing. Like I would be reading something and listening to the episode and just cutting out stuff that didn't sound right, and I can't really focus on doing that anymore. Yeah, so burnout is real. I think it's okay. One thing that's cool about these is that I do like give a peek behind the curtain, but they're kind of timeless. You can go back to season 1 and re-listen to the entire season and not really feel like, you know, you missed anything. You can, or not really feel like it's out of time or something. It's not like it's episodic content based on real life stuff, right? This is based on games that came out 20, 30 years ago, depending on which game. I mean, this, you know, these are like 25 plus years ago. I am looking forward to, I think one thing that drives me is I am looking forward to playing Final Fantasy VII and going into the 3D world. I think the 2D fantasy heavy Final Fantasy is not as fun for me anymore. I mean, there are 6 of them, and some of them are more fantasy than others. And, you know, and this story is very similar to Final Fantasy II, so it's like, it would be great to have a little bit more variety. And I know that Final Fantasy VII, I played through 1/3 of it several times. So I know that that's, you know, I'm not going to be walking around as a wizard entering an old town that, you know, an ancient empire was trying to get into. No, I'll be walking into a mine that was taken over by a corporation, right? Like very like more modern topics. So I think that's going to be interesting. Thank you for listening. You can check me out on Twitter, on twitter.com/EFpodcast. It's great for knowing when the new episodes come out. I haven't been super active on it, but who knows, by the time this comes out, might be a little bit different, might not be. But yeah, that's it. Talk to you all next time.